up a story tonight from the latter part of 2 Samuel 21, where there is a very distinct break in the record from the previous incident that we looked at. And what we find, in fact, if we look at the next little bit of the record of 2 Samuel, that there's these details about wars with the Philistines here. And then there is this, in chapter 22, there's this remarkable psalm of deliverance, followed by the last words of David, which is a very poetic section in its own right. And then we find at the end of chapter 23, from verse 8 onwards to the end of that chapter, we have a list of a catalogue of David's mighty men. So we have something about David's mighty men and their exploits at the start, and at the end it bookends these two poetic structures in the centre. Now, I'm not going to say a lot more about the arrangement and how it all plays out. Hopefully, God willing, at the start of next year, we're going to continue on and just finish off the 2nd of Samuel. But we will come back to this big structure. We don't want to spend time on that tonight. But what we're intending to do tonight really is tackle these two sections which are in orange there. The first that we've just read is a list of 4, well, they're very short records, aren't they, really, of 4 remarkable victories, individual battles that had occurred with the Philistines where victory was gained. And then the other part of the night we're going to spend on the list of David's mighty men, which is the other bookend of this. And we're going to see later on just exactly why the Spirit has written things the way they are written, without going into that at the moment. Well, this record here, let's come to it straight away in verse 15 of 2 Samuel 21. Because the parallel record for your interest is in 2 Chronicles 20, verses 4 to 8. It's worth putting a thing in your margin. There possibly is one there anyway, but it's always helpful to have a parallel record, if there is one, in front of you, or where you can easily reference it. You know, First of Chronicles actually places... Sorry, did I say 2 Chronicles? I meant First of Chronicles. First of Chronicles 20, not 2 Chronicles. First of Chronicles places these events after the war with Amnon. So if the events in Chronicles are consecutive, that is historically in order, which I think there's no reason to dispute in most cases, then these battles here occurred at least after the war with Ammon, which is after David's sin. Now, the interesting thing is that we know that David dealt a pretty severe blow and very effective blow at the Philistines on a couple of occasions earlier. 2 Samuel 5, on 2 separate battles, David attacked the Philistines. In fact, they came to attack him once he'd taken Jerusalem. That was the instigating point. But the second time that we find David in conflict with the Philistines again is in 2 Samuel 8. And at that time, we won't turn to that right now, but at that time it says that David subdued the Philistines. Now that's a pretty significant word, because that didn't happen very many times against the Philistines. The Philistines were a constant threat. But it appears that the Philistines poked up their heads again in Israel at this time, somewhere here, possibly after the events, if this is in chronological order, after the days of the famine. But there's a number of battles here mentioned, 4 in fact, that are mentioned. But you know, this is the interesting thing about this, because this is telling us something about the characteristics of the Philistines, and what we already know about the Philistines is perfectly in line with this. They were a warlike people, they were very resilient, and they were extremely determined. Almost every attempt that Israel had over centuries to get rid of them, they couldn't actually get rid of them. They subdued them on a number of occasions, under Samuel, under Samson for a little while, but that wasn't a complete subjugation. But they kept popping their heads up and having a go at Israel again. And And that's very unlike a lot of the other nations around. For example, David had a number of campaigns against the nations around and extended the borders significantly through his reign. And most of those other nations didn't bob their heads up again. They were so badly beaten, they were put under tribute. They said, okay, David, you're king, we'll just keep paying the money, that's all right. Not so the Philistines. The Philistines never paid tribute. They never actually wanted to be subjected to anything that David was doing or Israel was ever doing. And they here pop up again. Well, verse 15 says, moreover, the Philistines had yet war again with Israel. If you've got a pencil, a coloured pencil, you really need to get it out, because there's a number of things in just these verses. I wonder whether when we're reading we're attuned to what the Spirit is saying. Because when you find in the Bible, in a Bible record, there are things coming back and back and back again, they're being repeated in close succession, God is actually trying to tell us something. And did you notice in verse 15 it says the Philistines had war again? The previous wars with David were now coming back. But verse 18 says, it came to pass after this, there was again a battle. And verse 19, and there was again a battle in Gob. And verse 20, and there was yet another one in Gath. Again and again and again it came back. And we're being told something here, brothers and sisters. This record has been written like this for our instruction, but we've got to work out what it's trying to tell us. But you notice that as we read through those record of these 4 battles, there was always the Philistines involved, every one of those. Now, Israel had other enemies around, and they could have risen up, but none of them did. Well, none of them did like this. And the Philistines are in every single one of these battles. Not only that, in every one of these battles, colour it in. There's a giant in every one. A giant. How many giants do you get that are great warriors? How many giants do you read, through the period of Samuel and Saul? We don't read of any until you come through that period, until we come to Goliath. But now there's 4 here in relatively quick succession. But not only that, every single one of those giants is related to each other. There's something interesting going on here. And every single one of them is defeated by David and his servants. We might just take that, read that, oh yes, this giant was defeated, oh this one was slain, oh this one was slain, oh yes, read on, next chapter. Imagine what that actually meant to knock out one of these giants. The spies, when they went into the land, 10 of them came back absolutely trembling and told Israel, we can't go. We can't go in there because we're terrified of the giants. And when Israel came into the land, they were terrified of giants. And not only that, for over 500 years, the giants, wherever they were, and they were in a few little pockets, but the Philistine giants and the other giants of the Amorites, and there were a few, as I said, they kept on plaguing Israel. And really, Israel never got on top of them. But here we find the waves of the Philistines coming back and back and back until, in the days of Saul, they brought out their greatest weapon that they'd ever showed Israel. And it was in a mighty hunk of flesh. It was a giant like Israel had never seen. And he walks out onto the plain, the valley of Elah, and defies Israel to send a man, and the whole battle would be won or lost depending on that. And you know what it actually says in 1 Samuel 17? It says, the great warriors of Israel in Saul's army fled when he walked out onto that battlefield, and they were sore afraid. They were absolutely terrified. Now, just hold your hand here in 2 Samuel 21 and just go back to 1 Samuel 17, which is this story, because along comes David on the scene as a teenager. He's not a seasoned, hardened warrior, though he's had lots of experience even in his few teenage years. And he is just stunned that no one is actually going to take this giant down. But all these mighty men are looking at this giant and thinking, how on earth do you knock this fellow out? We've got no chance against him. Because their worldview was different. They were looking at things completely differently. And when David came, this is what he said, verse 32. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul is just stunned. He's very pleased that someone says they're going to go and fight him, but he's just stunned at this teenager who can say, yeah, what's everyone frightened about? He's only a giant. Let's go and get him. If no one will get him, I'll go and take him out. And when David eventually goes out onto that field, this is what he says in the face of the giant, in the hearing of all Israel, in verse 46. He said, "This day will Yahweh deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know there's a God in Israel, and more particularly, that all this assembly who are cowering and fearful of giants, that all this assembly shall know that Yahweh does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands." That was an utterly stunning revelation to all of Israel, brothers and sisters, that this battle was not Yahweh's, was not theirs, but it was Yahweh's. And God does not save by sword and spear. Because every one of those mighty men in Saul's army was thinking, how can we possibly get this fellow down? It doesn't matter how big a sword or spear that we've got, one-on-one, we have no hope. Because all they ever thought of is sword and spear. And David's mind is 1,000 miles from there. This is God's battle. And now we find, back over in 2 Samuel 21, another giant appearing. And then another one. And then another and another. That's astounding. All these giants. And one by one, they're taken out by David's men. One by one. There's none of this spirit that was in Saul's army before that has them cowering behind the rocks and saying, we don't know what to do. Every one of these was taken out. This record is telling us there was not a giant able to stand before David and his men. But you know, David did not fight these giants. Who did? His men. And this victory that we find recorded here towards the end of David's life is a testimony to the amazing inspiration that he had upon men and women, and particularly some of the fighting men in Israel from so far back. Because, you know, when you look at this, stand back and look at that little section of the scripture here, what we see is that we've got all these giants who are relatives of Goliath. We find all these victors who are relatives of David. If you look, there was Abishai, who was his nephew. There was Jonathan in the fourth one, who was his nephew. And the other two are Judahites as well. So, but just even the language that's used connects us back to Goliath, to this battle between Goliath and David. So here, in fact, is a battle of faith. A battle of faith that's been inspired by a man who was only a teenager at the time, who had the faith to go up against All odds that he could never physically have a go at, because he knew that God was with him. And these men here, every one of them has been inspired by David. You know, the lesson there is powerful, brothers and sisters, and it ought to inspire us. Because David and Goliath, in the divine record, is a classic, absolutely classic outworking of the enmity that started in the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 3, between the seed of the flesh, the seed of the woman, and the seed of the serpent. And those two forces were going to be at loggerheads all through time until one knocked out the other. And so Goliath there represented the power of sin. He's covered in brass. All his pieces of armour all weigh 6. They've got 6 in them. This is telling us something. He's an imposing, boastful image of the flesh, defying God. And David comes along, representing our Lord Jesus Christ in humility, trusting implicitly in God, and deals sin a fatal wound in the head. This story is a continuation of that. But why did we need to know about these giants here then? Certainly the situation with David and Goliath is a classic upon which much of the scriptures are taken and built. The story is built, the language is built from there in this final battle. But you know, brothers and sisters, the reason for Christ's victory was not just for him, just like David. David did not go out into the valley of Elah just to save his own skin. He went out there because of his people, and in the process of taking Goliath down, he was saved and the nation was saved. That's just amazing, isn't it? And when we come to Hebrews 2, we're very, very familiar with Hebrews 2 that says, you know, Jesus was of the same nature as us, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil. But you know, it doesn't stop there. The very next verse says, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. You know, brothers and sisters, the Israelites were terrified of the Philistines, especially the big ones. And they were in bondage for years and years and years from the time that the Philistines first came in contact with them in the land. And David now freed them. But what's beautiful about this, brethren and sisters, the really beautiful thing here is that David, by his action out in the valley of Elah, had inspired a generation of young men to rise and face the giant by faith and to slay him. And it didn't matter how many times that giant kept coming back, whether he was the same one or another one. David had inspired his men to be able to do the same thing. You know, brothers and sisters, that's exactly the story of our lives. That is exactly where we are. Jesus has come and killed the giant. But you know, we're going to find giants popping up. Philistines are going to keep running back at us. So even though Jesus has destroyed sin, the Philistines are still there. And the giants are going to come. And it's not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. That's what that record's telling us. They're going to keep coming back. But the interesting and beautiful thing is that the inspiration of David and of Jesus is there for his followers to slay every one of those whenever or wherever they pop up. You know, sin is the giant, brothers and sisters, in essence, I suppose. And it attacks again and again. Sometimes in our lives it looks bigger than life. Problems can look bigger than they really are to us. It depends on how we're looking at them, though. And every time they come, did you notice here, every single one of those battles is on Philistine territory, because that's where the Philistines are just very comfortable, and that's where sin's very comfortable. And that's where we'll meet them. But we don't need to be frightened of giants. They don't need to erode our faith, brothers and sisters, because David gave us the key and Jesus used it. The battle is Yahweh's. If we want to try and fight, brethren and sisters, difficulties in our lives, if we're going to try and fight sin with swords and spears, if we're going to try and do it in our might, and we're going to try by willpower and doing all kinds of other things, we will never take down that giant. David had the key back there that inspired a generation around him. Faith can knock out any giant. In fact, brothers and sisters, every giant. Because that record doesn't say, oh, they knocked out 3, but they missed the 4th. Every single one. What did John say? 1 John 5, verse 4. This is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. Oh, that sounds all very easy. We all think we have faith, brothers and sisters. But if we have faith in the face of a giant, it means we'll run at that giant knowing that there's no possible way by human means we can take it down. And God miraculously, by faith, will remove it. That's how we have to meet the challenges of life, fully assured that God is with us. Like the Apostle Paul said in Philippians 4, he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Faith doesn't have failures because they were all slain here. But what are our giants? Oh, if we just talk about giants in terms of being sin, it's all very, well, we can walk away and it doesn't make any difference. I'd like you to come over to 2 Corinthians, because I think Paul defines our giants. 2 Corinthians 10. In verse 3, he says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. That's David. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. They're not worldly. They're not swords and spears, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. We're on the same ground here, but this is relevant. And I'd like to read the next verse to you from the ESV, and it says this: we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. And in that verse, brothers and sisters, we have a definition of our giants. And I think there are giants that are outside and there are giants that are inside. Inside us. We destroy arguments and thinking and opinions and philosophies. We are bombarded with this stuff, brothers and sisters. Everywhere we go, in every bit of media, we're being bombarded all the time about lofty opinions that are raised against the knowledge of God. The flesh in its natural thinking, and we don't have to be sophisticated, and it doesn't have to be an arch enemy out there that does that. This can actually happen, and we can be influenced by those things that are raised against the knowledge of God. They are giants. And the problem that we face is that sometimes we just don't see how gigantic they are until they've actually got us by the throat. And he says, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. Aha, there's another giant. He's growing. And our thoughts, brothers and sisters, that take us off, the thinking of the flesh, every thought that raises itself against the knowledge of God, it's got to be taken captive. Verse 6, having inner readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. So we're on the same ground as these, mighty warriors back in David's day that battle after battle met the Philistine giants and defeated them. Well, let's now turn our attention to chapter 23, which we haven't read because I had pity on Adam tonight and all these names. And, there's quite a bit of text there. You're probably reasonably familiar with it, but we'll have a look at bits of that as we go. So what we've got here is a list of David's mighty men that is on the other bookend of these two poetic pieces in the centre. And I think what we really need to understand right at the start is that the victories of these men that are listed here in David's mighty men helped David to establish his kingdom. And when we just think about the structure briefly, and I'm not going to go into this in much detail, we'll come back to this in our next class. This leads on to David's celebration of deliverance by faith. That's the psalm. And you can see why, following on from 2 Samuel 21, why it's appropriate for David to celebrate the deliverance by faith from God. And then we find David's last words, which are always important. Everyone's last words are always important. But David's last words are very unusual compared to most. They're actually a vision of someone greater than himself, his own son, who was going to come and establish a kingdom and put down the wicked. That's David's last words in a nutshell. And so the context of this list of mighty men comes following that. It's in the context of David's kingdom. In fact, an even better kingdom being established. Better than his, which is interesting, isn't it? Hold your hand if you're in 2 Samuel 23 and just go over to Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 11. In 1 Chronicles 11, verse 10, we read, this is the start of the Chronicles record of this. These also are the chief of the mighty men whom David had, who strengthened themselves with him in his kingdom and with all Israel, to make him king according to the word of Yahweh concerning Israel. Now, that's the authorised version, but the margin of the authorised version says that these are the chief of the mighty men of David that David had, who held strongly with him in his kingdom and with all Israel to make him king. So the first thing we need to notice is that one of the roles of these mighty men was to actually establish the kingdom. Which means that some of these mighty men must have been in place before he became king. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? And we'll see in a minute some of the incidents that happened probably were even way earlier than just before the kingdom started. But the mighty men were helpers for the kingdom. And that's all I'm going to say about this at the moment, because you're going to see echo after echo after echo through what happens from here in this amazing type that I'm not going to put up in a big long list and bore you with, but just watch out for it. Because here is a type, brothers and sisters, of all the mighty men that Jesus will have to help him set up his kingdom. And there's a list of them as well. So this is not an academic exercise. And I want you just to keep your eyes and your mind alert to those echoes as they come. We'll point out some of them, but there's lots and lots of others that we won't actively talk about tonight. Come back to 2 Samuel 23, and as the record starts here, it says just what seems to be a plain and ordinary comment. Verse 8, "These be the names of the mighty men whom David had." Let's stop. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. David had. What that means, brothers and sisters, these men belonged to David. In fact, right at the start of this list, we are being told these men are mighty because of David. They are mighty because David has them. None of them had any claim to glory or fame apart from that. Well, this story of the mighty men is about how they became attached to David and how they helped him establish the kingdom. But where do they come from, and where does this story start? Well, it's not just starting here, that's for sure. It's going right back. You remember David's early life. We're not going to go into any detail about this. After he had the battle with Goliath, everybody in the nation knew of his fame. And he became a captain in Saul's army, had great victories, and it even eclipsed Saul's glory. The whole nation knew about him, were talking about him. He was a man that everyone wanted to know and wanted to meet. And then Saul became insanely jealous, intensely turned against David, and David is forced to leave. We know the story of that very well. And he becomes an outcast, brothers and sisters. There's no other word for it. He's a marked man. He has no friends. He's actually lonely. And he's forced on one occasion, because how he's going to maintain himself, how he's even going to stay alive, he doesn't know, and he goes into Philistine territory for safety. Philistine territory! David going into Philistine territory. That's how bad it actually got for him. And he feigns madness there because they see that he's David, and under the providence of God he comes back. Now, hold your hand here and come over to Psalm 142. Psalm 142 was written right now, at that point. When he was in the cave, that is after he'd come back from the situation that he faced in the land of the Philistines, in Gath. Notice the superscription, a prayer when he was in the cave. And it says, verse 1, "I cried unto Yahweh with my voice, and with my voice unto Yahweh did I make supplication. I poured out my complaint before him." By complaint, it doesn't mean he was complaining. It's his whole terrible situation that he couldn't deal with. That's what it means. "And I showed before him all my trouble." He opened his whole heart up to God. His spirit was overwhelmed within him. But look at verse 4. "And I looked on my right hand, and beheld, there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul." David is in a terrible, terrible plight here, brothers and sisters. His friends, his family have distanced themselves from him, because to be associated with David now was to be a marked and dead man. But look at verse 5. Who else could he turn to? "I cried unto thee, O Yahweh, and said, Thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. Attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I." He was a terrible giant. But I'd like to read verse 7 from Rotherham. And verse 7 says, "About me let the righteous gather round, for thou wilt deal bountifully with me." And so his spirit lifts at the end, brothers and sisters. And he prays after having put his confidence and absolute trust in God despite the desperate nature of the circumstances he's in. He prays that God will let the righteous gather around him. You know what? God answered that prayer. And we have the answer in 1 Samuel 22. And verse 1. This context, look at it. David's just fled from Gath. He's just come back to the cave of Adullam. It's where the psalm was written. Verse 1. David therefore departed thence and came to the cave of Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. So his brethren and his father's house, his relatives, came down, at least for a time. Verse 2. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves under him and became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. David didn't seek that support, brothers and sisters. He didn't go out running around the country trying to find who he could have as friends. He trusted that God would answer his prayer. And voluntarily, men from all over the place, 400 of them came. They were in anguish, they were up to their ears in debt, they were bitter of soul, which is what discontent means. This was a liability for David. How could he hide now? He's got 400 men to look after. Before he could run from cave to cave and get away from Saul or whatever. And how is he going to provide for so many? And what about all their backgrounds? How is he going to deal with all these misfits? They were going to be fighting and taking each other's lives in his presence before long. But you know, brothers and sisters, God knew what was best for David. And he knew what was best for those who came. There weren't many wise, and there weren't many noble, and there weren't even very many mighty, and there weren't any honourable, or very few in that company, because God was calling the weak things of the world to confound the mighty. But you know, David turned away none of those people, because God was doing in the big picture. He had already anointed David, and he needed to now prepare David for kingship. And here it was. He brought all these misfits to David, 400 in a cave on the run. And David was to treat them as if they were the righteous that God had brought around him. But the remarkable part of this story is that David turned that mixed multitude into a loyal, unified, powerful force that not only supported him, but forwarded the cause of his kingdom and extended the boundaries of the kingdom of God on earth to its fullest extent ever. That's an amazing story, brothers and sisters. And it all started with a prayer in desperation because he couldn't see a way through and he asked God. And this record tells us in verse 2 that towards the end and he became a captain over them. A captain over them. In your margin, brothers and sisters, put Hebrews 2 verse 10, because there it says, "And it became him for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering." And over the next 8 years, approximately that sort of time, there was immense difficulty in that cave with those 400 men. There was deprivation, there was hardship, there was suffering, there were tears aplenty. And in the process, both captain and men were being prepared for a kingdom that wasn't even established yet. Oh, it was established under Saul, but that wasn't really what God wanted to see. But you know, brothers and sisters, that's the story of our lives, isn't it? We come voluntarily to Christ. It's not as if we have our arms twisted, and we're drawn to him because of who he is, because of what we know of him, because of his renown, because he's the anointed of God, because we know he's a man after God's own heart, like they knew as well. And all of us are nobodies. None of us have got anything to commend ourselves when we come. We're all discontents. Some of us are still discontents. We're all in debt to God. We're all in distress in this world. We're far from perfect, any of us, brothers and sisters. And we come wanting to change allegiance. You know, that's what it actually says in Chronicles. It says they came to take the kingdom from Saul to David. To change king from king sin to king of righteousness. And Jesus becomes a captain over us to shape, to discipline, to transform us into a force that's unified and thinking alike, so that in his forwarding of his kingdom we might be useful. It's an amazing story, isn't it? And these men, there must have been some who dropped out along the way. But these men had to learn to work together. They had to learn to think about other people. You can't win a battle on your own. You can't knock out the Syrians or the Ammonites or the Philistines with your individual prowess. But together, and devoting themselves to David and learning from him and getting behind his cause, David changed them. Yeah, how did he change them, brothers and sisters? Ever thought about that? He's running for his life every day, for year after year after year. There's some of those 400 are up on the cliffs looking out to see where Saul's coming. And then Saul's coming right, and they've got to just move caves. And constantly that was going on through that whole period. It's an exceedingly difficult period of his life, brothers and sisters. But he starts with these misfits, hotheads, impetuous, obviously some of them. He called them lions. And on one occasion they even wanted to take his life because they were so upset. They'd lost their families. But there were two things that changed those men. And they were his word, which was God's word, and his example. I'd like you to turn to Psalm 34. You know, Psalm 34 is just beautiful. And look at the context. This is written following him just coming out of Gath, when he changed his behaviour and had to feign himself mad. So the very, very context when these men were coming to him, this was David's experience. This is what David is thinking at that very time. Verse 1, I will bless Yahweh at all times. His praise shall be continually in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in Yahweh. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. This is about David's telling us about his relationship with God. That's how he is. He's the humble. He's making his boast in Yahweh. He's praising God continually. He doesn't think anything of himself. But look at verse 3. Oh, magnify Yahweh with me. You know, these songs, brothers and sisters, written by David, were written to be sung, and many of them would have been sung in the cave. Over and over and over again. So David states his confidence and then says, oh, all of you, magnify Yahweh with me, and let us exalt his name together. I'll tell you why, verse 4. I sought Yahweh, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. Verse 5. And they looked unto him and flowed unto him, as the margin says, and their faces were not ashamed. Then he goes back to himself. This poor man cried, and Yahweh heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. And the angel of Yahweh encamps around not just him, but them, all of them, all of you in the cave, and delivers them. Oh, taste and see, taste and see. Verse 11, come, ye children, hearken unto me, and I'll teach you the fear of Yahweh. Ye children? You know, David's about 22 or 3 at the most at this stage. And he's talking to his children, many of whom would have been much older than him. Some of whom would have been his age. I'll teach you the fear of Yahweh. What does he say? What man is he that desires life and loveth many days, that he may see good? Keep thy tongue from evil and thy lips from speaking guile. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. You know, brothers and sisters, there would have been men in that cave who'd never heard anything like this in their life before. But they saw this man, and no matter what they thought of him to start with, they slowly began to have an impact upon them. Verse 22, Yahweh redeems the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. Here's the most important lesson he left with them, brothers and sisters, and time again in his psalms you find, if they were sung, and they obviously were many times in that company, there's this crucial lesson of trust, the importance of faith, and his life, his own life, epitomised it. And he taught men and showed men how to trust. He showed them how to pray. He taught them the value of trust in God. Oh, he was a natural leader, there's no question about that. But before any of them could truly be called a mighty man belonging to David, they had to learn the secret of David's life. You know, this diverse group they were from different nations, because when we come back to 2 Samuel 23, we find, looking down the list, there are a number that came from other countries. They're in David's mighty men. You wonder how on earth they ever got there. There were people from all different tribes. They were different ages, different backgrounds. But the one thing they had in common, the one thing, is that they were drawn to David with a respect and a love that eventually transformed them and committed them 100% to his cause. And his cause was the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, where God was in the middle. And so they became, with him as captain over them, by his example and his encouragement, they became his Gibborim, his mighty men. And towards the end of his life, we find how they saw him. We read it earlier in chapter 21. This is 2 Samuel 21. But we just gloss straight over this. In the incident of the first giant, Ishai-Benob, who thought to have slain David, end of verse 16, and Abishai the son of Zeruiah succoured him, or came to his aid, and smote the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swear unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light, the lamp, the candle of Israel. I find that astounding, brothers and sisters. They knew, these hardened warriors knew that if he was taken from them, their light would go out. Their world would collapse. Because they saw him as a man of unshakable faith, of supreme confidence in God. A man who, because he was a man after God's own heart, had an integrity and a sense of justice, of mercy and truth that was like no other they'd ever come across. He was the inspiration of those men and of the nation. But it was only, brothers and sisters, not because he was a natural leader. It was only because he was first and foremost a man after God's own heart. That's his supreme characteristic, brothers and sisters. And these men knew it. They called him the lamp of Israel. And his greatest son came along 1,000 years later and said to his own generation, I am the light of the world. David was only a reflection, a little hand lamp that was reflecting God's light. But the true light came into the world that we have, brothers and sisters, and I wonder how we compare with the spirit of these men. But let's have a look at the list in chapter 23. And as you can see, I'm not intending to spend a lot of time just on the detail and, telling you 400 meanings of names, and I don't think there's any value in that, really. What we are going to do, though, is actually just have a look at this structure, and there seems to be somewhat of a hierarchy. Now, I'd have to say, I'd read this chapter with these names of mighty men for years, and I think every time I read it, this is so confusing. Parts of it are really clear, and parts of it are confusing. The 3 and the 30 and the this and that, and it just becomes really quite. It's not actually that difficult. Though, commentators and translators have obviously had a bit of a field day with this. But what we actually find in principle just recorded, let's just look at the big picture. We find 3, they're called the 3, men of renown to start that are named. And then there's 3 of the 30, they're called, who are unnamed. And then there's another 2 that are named. And then there's the 30 that are named at the end, the whole rest of the list of David's mighty men. And it certainly seems very clear that there was a supreme group of 3, and there was a group of 30, but the muddy area is in the centre as to what actually was going on with these 3 of 30 and these other 2 names, and how does that all fit? Well, we'll have a look at that very briefly in a minute. I'll make some suggestions, but I'm not going to be dogmatic. Well, if you count the names, has anyone ever counted them? You don't need to count them because it says, what does it say? Verse 39, 37 in all. But if you count them, there's not 37. There's problem number 1. There's 36. And when you go to Chronicles, there's another 16 added on the end of the list. Chronicles are written a bit later, and it certainly seems that as some of the mighty men either died or retired, others were added to the 30. So that there was always at least if not more, there was always at least a great group of 3 mighty men and the 30 mighty. Doesn't matter at what period of history, though it goes right back. You know, most of the names, if you look through here, you will not know most of them. They occur nowhere else before or after. They just appear on the page and disappear. And there are 5, however, whose exploits we're told about. And we'll look at that very briefly in just a minute. But let's come to the first 3 in verse 8, because it says, "These are the names of the mighty men whom David had, the Tachmonite that sat in the seat, chief among the captains. The same was Adino the Eznite, and he lifted up his spear against 800 whom he slew at one time." And then we're told about Eliezer in verse 9, and then we're told about Shammah in verse 11. 3 of them who were these elite mighty men. You know, we know nothing outside that chapter in Chronicles and Samuel about these 3. They never appear before in David's reign nor after. But there's remarkable stories of superhuman victory and achievement here. Like, this is just astounding. How do you kill 800 men at once? It's clearly through faith and with God's help. And in fact, that's exactly what it tells us. So they're evidently very godly men, because if you've got your pencil again, we find this little refrain happening in verse 10. "And Yahweh wrought a great victory that day," and again in verse 12, "and Yahweh wrought a great victory." So these mighty men are involved in some extraordinary acts of faith and courage. And they probably gained their renown very early in the conflicts with the Philistines, because it does tell us at least that the second 2 were with the Philistines. Now, given the fact that it does say in both the second and the third that Israel retracted and just couldn't even stand up to the Philistines, and these Eliezer and Shammah actually stayed once with David but once on his own, or possibly with just his bodyguard or other men around him, and fought the Philistines defending the inheritance. So that didn't happen in David's stay as king. So these victories precede David in the kingship, in the time of Saul somewhere, but probably at a time when they were possibly under David's own captainship, because you remember he was a general in Saul's army and had 1,000 men under him, and gained great victories during that time. Well, it's a little bit difficult. I don't want to go into a lot of technical stuff, but I'll just do this very, very, very briefly. Because this verse, the Tachmonite, when you look at the Chronicles record, looks actually quite different. It calls him the Tachmonite, and in Chronicles it calls him Jashabim the Hachmonite. Well, the Hachmonite and the Tachmonite are exactly the same, essentially the same Hebrew. But that little phrase, "that sat in the seat," is a corruption of the word Jashabim. It's actually the word Jashabim, translated. It shouldn't have been translated. So it should have been Jashabim, the Hachmonite or the Tachmonite. And he was chief amongst the captains, the same as Adino the Eznite. Well, Adino the Eznite, according to almost every commentator, and the vast majority of translations change this, is not meant to be a name at all. It's actually an epithet. It's actually a description. And the description is that he wielded his spear. And over in Chronicles you find, he lifted up his spear. And in fact, in the authorised version in Samuel, in verse 8, it says, "he lifted up his spear," but it's in italics, and the translators thought it needed to be in there, not realising at that time that Adino the Eznite actually meant that. So it should have been translated. So there's not very much difference between those 2 verses, apart from the numbers, 800 or 300. Well, I don't care. 800 or 300, it's just a massive victory by faith. Now, we know that this Jashabim actually came to David when he was in Ziklag, because 1 Chronicles 12 verse 1 tells us And he was a divisional army captain in David's army, you know, when David established his whole army structure. But the other complication in this little bit of text is when you compare the two records in Samuel and Chronicles, Shammah doesn't appear in Chronicles. And I think if you look at what I've done there and lined up the text in that way, it certainly looks, and the majority of Hebraists actually believe, that what has actually happened, a few lines of the Hebrew text have been completely omitted in copying, because it's very similar at the point where it breaks, and if you have a look at it, that bit in blue there, which finishes off the details about Eliezer, some of it's missing, and then the start of the bit about Shammah is missing, that is, his name's missing, but all the details are the same, apart from the fact that there was a lentil field and a barley field, which is quite easily explained because, you know, fields just didn't have one thing in them. They often had sections with different crops in them, so it could have been described as a lentil field or a barley field. That's not a real problem. So we actually therefore have this situation of three generals here. And David, we know, even when he was in the wilderness, had organised his people, his men into three camps. And later, in fighting at Mahanaim, when Absalom came against him, he divided them into three again. And maybe this is telling us something about the structure. We don't know. But the qualities that we get from those men are really quite interesting. Just note this. First of all, they had a faith that just defied all odds. And they were the greatest of the mighty. That's the first thing to notice. That's what makes a mighty man. And they had a commitment to David's cause that meant they would endure until the end, until their hands stuck to the sword and they couldn't peel it off, and to the point of exhaustion. And their commitment was such to David that they didn't stand and just run with the crowd. If the crowd ran away from the Philistines and there was still something to be done, they stood and defended it. And the inheritance is what they were defending. Yeah, a great man. But then we find the 3 of the 30 in verse 13. And 3 of the 30 chief went down and came to David in the time of harvest under the cave of Adullam, and the troop of the Philistines pitched in the valley of Rephaim. And David was then in the hold. Give you a map. This is what the situation was. The green's the valley of Rephaim, which is very close to Jerusalem. The Philistines, and it's probably around the time of 2 Samuel chapter 5, when the Philistines came up into the valley of Rephaim. David is down in the cave of Adullam. He's just taken Jerusalem not long. The Philistines are angry about it, and they're coming up into the valley of Rephaim. And they have a garrison in Bethlehem. And David in the cave happens to say, for a drink of water from the well at Bethlehem, just decrying the situation and wishing that they could turn it all around. And 3 of his men, 3 of the 30, go through the Philistine fighting machine. This is an amazing feat, because the Philistines were not just a bunch of wimps. They were alert and disciplined. They were absolutely on guard all the time. But these men made David's wish their command, even though he didn't really even mean that. And what did David do? When they came back with that water, he was so moved by that. He was moved by their love and their devotion to him. And he saw that water as blood in the glass. And there's no possible way that he could drink that, because he knew that God had said, "You must not eat blood, for the blood is in the life, and thou shalt pour it out on the ground as water." And David tipped that water that they'd risked their lives for on the ground in front of them. He poured it out before Yahweh as a sacrifice of men's life who were prepared to die for him. That's what David's mighty men thought of him. You know, brothers and sisters, we can say, like Peter said, "Oh, Lord, I'll die for you. Oh, wherever you're going, to the cross, I'll go as well." Old Peter found he couldn't go. Here's men who went. This is truly mighty men. And then in verse 18 we find two men mentioned. Abishai, first of all, and we got some details about him. And then we've got Benaiah in verse 20. Sorry, I said verse 18, Abishai, verse 20, Benaiah. And this is the point where it becomes most confusing, because in the Hebrew, the word 3 and the word 30 and the word captain are all very similar. And the translators have even had difficulty working out whether it means 3, 30 or captain. And you find, if you look at a whole range of translations, you'll find some say 3, some say 30, some say captain, 3, 30, captain, just mix up. But I think as time has gone on, many of the translations of this section have actually become much more consistent. And I think here's a classic example of what it probably should be. Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zerah, was chief of the 30. And he wielded his spear, and he won himself a name beside the 3. That is, he became renowned even alongside the other 3, the 3 mighty men at the start. And he was the most renowned of the 30, and he became their commander, but he didn't attain to the 3. That is, the first 3. And Benaiah is the same. He won a name because of his great exploits beside the 3 mighty men. That's the 3 up there. And he was renowned among the 30, but he didn't attain to the 3. He didn't get there. He wasn't placed in that position. You know, some of these men might later have when those older ones had died. But, and it's not very clear, because if you just read the authorised version, it seems like there's another group of 3, and there may very well have been. I'm not prepared to say that there was or wasn't. If there was a group of another 3, it means there's someone missing here. Abishai, Benaiah, who else? And it may well be these 2 men, Abishai and Benaiah, who were those who went to Bethlehem to get that water. It's certainly in keeping with their character from what we know, because these are 2 men we know a lot about outside of this record. The only 2 that we know a lot about outside this record. And they had amazing faith and amazing loyalty to their captain. I'll make a suggestion to say that possibly in that group of 3, Joab was there. Joab's name is conspicuously missing in this record, and I think deliberately so. Because though he was a great warrior and soldier, he defied his captain on many occasions. He murdered his opponents. He joined the rebellion against Yahweh's anointed. And in the end, his name was taken off the list. The honour roll does not include him. But then we have 30 from verse 24. They're just names. Just names. Most of whom we don't know. But you know, brothers and sisters, the really important thing about this is that they're remembered by David and they're recorded by God. We don't know all the details of their lives, but this we know. There are 2 essential characteristics of mighty men. David's or Christ's. Whose we are in prospect. And the first characteristic is that they were attracted to and attached to David. As a man after God's own heart, as a shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep, as the light of Israel. They were attracted to this man. He meant everything to them. And the second characteristic is they were absolutely loyal and committed to his cause. The cause was the kingdom of God on earth, the building of a people in whose hearts Yahweh would dwell. And all of those who had those characteristics, brothers and sisters, are in the book of life. And I think the question we've got to ask ourselves is, what's our attitude to our captain? And how committed to his cause. You know, though we know not a lot about these, yet we know this, that through faith they subdued kingdoms and wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of the fire, escaped the edge of sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the alien. They were slain with the sword, they wandered in sheepskins, goatskins. The world wasn't worthy of them, brothers and sisters. They wandered in deserts, mountains, dens, caves. They did, all of them. But these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, because God's provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthAndProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos, videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch, and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.